What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 16. Final look and sleeper picks.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 16, let's take a look at the quarterback position. So at the quarterback position, I like Matthew Stafford from the LA Rams playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the third most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has averaged 22.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 18% owned, projected at 20.7 fantasy points here in Week 16. He's $6,700 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48.5 points scored in this game, with the Rams favored by 3.5. So fantastic matchup here, and Matthew Stafford has scored 17, 24, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's going to be about 18% owned, so it looks like a lot of people like this play. Looks like he's the highest ownership percentage on the slate, right along with Justin Herbert. But you're going to save about $500 with this pick over Justin Herbert, and he has a better matchup. And this is a game that's going to be much closer, a much more competitive game here. So I do worry about Justin Herbert versus the Houston Texans, where the Chargers could get up by 2 touchdowns in that game, and Justin Herbert may not have to throw the ball all that much. So I prefer and I like Matthew Stafford here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, another quarterback that I like this week is Jalen Hurts from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the New York Giants, who have the 10th worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts has averaged 23 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 21.7 fantasy points here in Week 16. He's $6,400 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 10. So I like the rushing floor that you get from Jalen Hurts, and he scored 30 fantasy points last week. He had 8 rush attempts. So I like Jalen Hurts here versus the New York Giants. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So it looks like the guy that the top ownership on the slate is Alexander Mattison from the Minnesota Vikings playing the LA Rams. With Dalvin Cook out, Alexander Mattison will be the lead running back, and he should get something like 20 plus touches in this game. He's $6,800 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. He's going to be about 19% owned. So I think that's a pretty good play here. His salary is reasonable. He's got big upside. But the guy that I like a little bit more than Alexander Mattison is Cordell Patterson from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Cordell Patterson has averaged 17.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.2 rush attempts per game and 4.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 15% owned, projected at 16.5 fantasy points here in Week 16. He's 6,700 DraftKings salary, 500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42.5 points scored in this game, with the Falcons favored by 6.5. So Cordell Patterson has scored 4, 14, and 13 fantasy points in his last 3 games, but he scored 31 fantasy points in the game before that, and he does have monster upside, although he hasn't shown it all that much the past few weeks. He can get there because he's a running back and a wide receiver in one player, and let's see, the last 3 weeks he had 11, 16, and 13 rush attempts on top of 2, 5, and 5 pass targets. So he's getting somewhere between, let's see, 13 and 21 touches a game. This guy is an explosive player. He can catch the long ball. He's super fast. He can break a tackle for a touchdown. So I like Cordell Patterson in a fantastic matchup here versus the Detroit Lions.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won, and then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, another running back that I like is James Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Robinson has averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.4 rush attempts per game and 3.5 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 27% owned, projected at 16.6 fantasy points here in week 16. He's 5,900 DraftKings salary and 2,300 more on FanDuel. So they got him priced up on FanDuel, so I think this would be a DraftKings play for me. He scored 18 fantasy points last week off of 18 rush attempts and 6 pass targets. He's got the best matchup possible on the slate, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars trailing by 1.5. So I like James Robinson here versus the New York Jets. Okay, now I'm going to give you a sleeper pick, and this is kind of contingent on the health of DeAndre Swift. So DeAndre Swift is currently questionable. He either didn't practice or he was limited in practice. Let's take a look. He was limited in practice on Friday. So if DeAndre Swift is going to be out or limited, take a look at Craig Reynolds from the Detroit Lions playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 3rd worst defense overall. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, this play is high risk, high reward, but in the 2 games that Craig Reynolds has played, he's averaging 13.8 fantasy points off of 18.5 rush attempts and 1.5 pass targets. He scored 16 fantasy points last week off of 26 rush attempts and 1 pass target, and he's only 4,500 FanDuel salary and 1,500 more on FanDuel. But now, if DeAndre Swift is going to be healthy and not limited, he's going to be good to go for his full workload. I'd probably wouldn't play Craig Reynolds, but if DeAndre Swift is out, then I'm going to play Craig Reynolds here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Now, the other guy that I like that's low salary here is Justin Jackson from the LA Chargers playing the Houston Texans, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Justin Jackson scored 11 fantasy points off of 13 rush attempts and 1 pass target last week. He's going to be about 19% owned, projected at 14.1 fantasy points
here in week 16. He's 4,200 DraftKings salary and 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Chargers favored by 10.5. So fantastic matchup, and this could be a running game script. Like I mentioned before, if the Chargers can get up by a couple of touchdowns in this game, which I think they're going to do, I think Justin Jackson is going to get a bunch of carries in this game. And at only 4,200 DraftKings salary, he doesn't need much to hit value. Now, he will be competing in the backfield with, I think it's Joshua Kelly. Yeah, he'll be competing for touches with Joshua Kelly, but I do expect him to get 12 to 15 touches in this game. If he finds the end zone, he will certainly crush value at 4,200 DraftKings salary. So I think the game script for this pick and the matchup all makes sense. So I like Justin Jackson here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So now it looks like Tyler Lockett is going to be back. So I'm kind of torn on which Seattle wide receiver I want to play, DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett. I think I'm going to go with DK Metcalf here from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Chicago Bears, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the third most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DK Metcalf has averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.4 pass targets per game. He's only going to be about 5% owned, projected at 13.6 fantasy points here in week 16. He's 6,400 DraftKings salary, 300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game, with the Seahawks favored by 6.5. So fantastic wide receiver matchup here, and DK Metcalf has scored 11, 8, and 11 fantasy points off of 12, 8, and 8 pass targets. It's been a disappointing season for DK Metcalf, but I do believe he's now finally fully healthy. He had a foot injury that was hindering him throughout the season, or the last few weeks, or the last 4 or 5 weeks, or whatever it's been. So I think he's fully healthy now. Now, although there is Tyler Lockett back, that's just a guy that's going to take up those defenders in the backfield, which will give DK Metcalf more room to work. I just got to believe this guy is going to have a breakout game at some point in the season. And what better game to have it in a great matchup versus the Chicago Bears. So I like DK Metcalf, as I'd call him kind of a sleeper pick here at only 5% ownership here versus the Chicago Bears.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Now, if you're looking for a stud to play this week, of course, you got Cooper Kupp and Keenan Allen. I mean, Cooper Kupp, he's going to be about 44% owned. So I almost feel like this could be the week to fade Cooper Kupp, but then you look at the matchup here, and he's just got an unbelievable matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings, who give up the second most, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. He's 9,100 DraftKings salary, 700 more on FanDuel, averaging 28.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.7 pass targets per game. I mean, look at this guy's game log. Scored 38, 34, and 30 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 13, 15, and 10 pass targets. So I guess 44% ownership is about right. If I had two lineups, I definitely have one with Cooper Kupp and one without him. Because if for some reason he does flop in this game, maybe he gets injured or maybe he just doesn't score 30 fantasy points, then you're going to be ahead of the field in that lineup without Cooper Kupp. Now, it's just super risky not to have him in your lineup, because if he goes out there and does what he's been doing, then your lineup's going to be way behind. So that's why I think it's just the ownership is right here. Have him in 50% or close to it, and you should cover all your bases. So I like Cooper Kupp here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, now we want to take a look at a lower salary wide receiver, a couple of lower mid-range wide receivers that are in great spots here this week. Okay, so take a look at Antonio Brown from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing wide receivers. Antonio Brown has averaged 20.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.4 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 38% owned, projected at 16.4 fantasy points here in week 16. He's $4,900 DraftKings salary and $2,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Tampa Bay Bucks favored by 10. So we know Chris Godwin is out, Mike Evans is out, Leonard Fournette is out. So you're left with Antonio Brown, Rob Gronkowski, and oh, we forgot to mention Ronald Jones at the running back position. So don't forget about Ronald Jones. I think he's only like $5,100 DraftKings salary, and he should get plenty of work here in this game with Leonard Fournette out. But Antonio Brown at only $4,900 DraftKings salary, he could get a ton of pass targets in this game. And Tom Brady had a really bad game last week. So, you know, Tom Brady loves to have those monster bounce back games. So I like Antonio Brown here versus the Carolina Panthers. Okay, and another sleeper pick, or a sleeper pick that I like here this week, probably my favorite sleeper pick at the wide receiver position on the slate. I don't know why his ownership is so low. I guess it's because Antonio Brown is pulling all the ownership away from him at the same price point. So I like Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Tyler Boyd has averaged 11.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 2% owned, projected at 11.3 fantasy points here this week, and he's only $5,100 DraftKings salary. He's $1,100 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game, with the Bengals favored by 7.5. Tyler Boyd has scored 21, 10, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 5, and 7 pass targets. Now, Tyler Boyd has played pretty well pretty much all throughout the season, with the exception of a few weeks. I think he's always put up like at least 10 fantasy points. He's got that 20+ fantasy point upside at only 2% ownership, at only $5,100 DraftKings salary. I think a lineup with a guy like Antonio Brown and Tyler Boyd, that's got some punch in there, and you're going to save a lot of salary for the rest of your lineup. So I like Tyler Boyd here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I like Mark Andrews from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Mark Andrews has averaged 18.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 14 fantasy points here in week 16. He's 7,000 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 41.5 points scored in this game, with the Ravens trailing by 7.5. So you got a passing game script for the Ravens, and he's got a great tight end matchup here. He's been a monster the past 2 weeks. He scored 39, 32, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 13, 11, and 9 pass targets. So I like Mark Andrews here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, and we mentioned him earlier, but with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans out, it's going to open up more pass targets for Rob Gronkowski from the Tampa Bay Bucks, playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing tight ends. Rob Gronkowski has averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.4 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 13.7 fantasy points here in week 16. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary, 500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Bucks favored by 10. Rob Gronkowski has scored 5, 11, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 11, 9, and 8 pass targets, and I can see him getting 10 plus pass targets in this one, so I like Rob Gronkowski here versus the Carolina Panthers. Okay, another tight end that I like is Dallas Goddard from the Philadelphia Eagles, playing the New York Giants, who have the 10th worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Dallas Goddard has averaged 11.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 15% owned, projected at 12.4 fantasy points here in week 16. He's 5,100 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 10. Dallas Goddard has scored 24, 32, and 1 fantasy point in the last 3 games off of 9, 6, and 3 pass targets. So I like Dallas Goddard here versus the New York Giants. Okay, now a sleeper pick at the tight end position. This guy's got a fantastic matchup. His salary is low, so I like Noah Fant from the Denver Broncos, playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 6th worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Noah Fant has averaged 9.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.9 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 81% of the snaps, only going to be about 5% owned, projected at 8.9 fantasy points here in week 16. He's 4,400 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Broncos favored by 1. And Noah Fant has scored 11, 9, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 4, and 4 pass targets. So I like Noah Fant here versus the Las Vegas Raiders.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.